In 53 years, not a single human being has left the gravitational neighborhood of Earth and traveled to the moon. That gap is longer than most people appreciate. It spans the entire career of almost every scientist and engineer working in aerospace today. An entire generation was born, grew up, started families of their own, and watched their own children grow in the time between the last lunar mission and this one. And now, as early as April 2026, that changes. 4 astronauts are preparing to climb into a pressurized capsule roughly the size of 2 minivans, parked side by side and pointed at the moon. Their names are Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen. One will become the first woman to travel beyond low Earth orbit. Another will be the first person of color to do so. A third will be the first non-American. These are not incidental details. They reflect how much the human picture of spaceflight has shifted in the decades since Apollo, even as the destination remains the same. This mission is called Artemis II. It is not a landing. There will be no lunar surface operations, no moonwalks, no flag planted in regolith. What Artemis II is something arguably more difficult. A 10-day round trip to the moon and back with a crew aboard a spacecraft that has only ever flown once before, uncrewed, and whose heat shield cracked during return in ways that took nearly 2 years to fully understand. Every system, every material choice, every trajectory decision has been reconsidered in light of what that first flight revealed. And now 4 people are betting their lives on the conclusion. To understand what this mission actually involves, you have to start not with the moon, but with the ground, with the days before launch. The crew has been in quarantine for several days leading up to liftoff. They are isolated from family and friends, going through daily medical screenings, following a sleep schedule engineered by NASA's human performance teams, and eating according to a nutrition plan calibrated down to the individual calorie to ensure each crew member arrives at launch day properly hydrated, mentally sharp, and physically primed. The goal is simple. Your body is a system, and on launch day, that system needs to be running optimally. On the morning of launch, they suit up in what NASA calls the Orion Crew Survival System suits. These are not the sleek, form-fitted suits you see in science fiction films. They are bulky, pressurized garments, designed with a single overriding purpose: to keep the person wearing them alive if the cabin loses pressure at any point during ascent or re-entry. Think of them less as clothing and more as wearable emergency vehicles. They are heavy, uncomfortable in the way that anything designed purely for survival tends to be uncomfortable and absolutely necessary. The crew rides an elevator up the launch tower at Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. This is the same pad complex that launched the Apollo missions, and that continuity is not accidental. Pad 39B has been modified and upgraded extensively over the decades, but there is a deliberate historical thread being maintained. They climb into their spacecraft, which the crew has named Integrity. Integrity sits at the top of the Space Launch System, which NASA describes as the most powerful rocket it has ever built. The vehicle stands 322 feet tall, which is taller than the Statue of Liberty, including its pedestal, and weighs 5.75 million pounds fully fueled. That weight figure includes the propellants that will be consumed in the first few minutes of flight, and it gives you a sense of the sheer energy involved in getting 4 people off the ground and pointed toward the moon. Beneath the crew, 2 solid rocket boosters and 4 RS-25 main engines are preparing to produce 8.8 million pounds of thrust. For comparison, that is about 15% more thrust than the Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon during the 1960s and 70s. The Saturn V remains one of the most extraordinary pieces of engineering in human history, so exceeding it is not a trivial statement. The RS-25 engines are worth dwelling on for a moment. They are not entirely new designs. They are evolved and recertified versions of the same engines that powered the Space Shuttle orbiter for 30 years, from 1981 through 2011. Engineers essentially took engines proven over 135 shuttle missions, redesigned key components, updated manufacturing processes, and adapted them to work on a rocket they were never originally intended for. It is an engineering philosophy that prioritizes proven reliability alongside modern improvement, and it reflects a hard-won lesson from spaceflight history. Novel is not always better when lives are at stake. Inside the capsule, Reed Wiseman sits in the commander's seat on the left side of the instrument panel. Victor Glover, the pilot, sits to his right. Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen, designated as mission specialists, are seated in the row behind them. 4 adults in a pressurized cabin, measuring approximately 330 cubic feet of habitable volume. NASA often describes this space using the 2 minivan comparison, noting that it represents roughly 60% more room than the Apollo command module gave its 3-person cruise. That is technically accurate and somewhat misleading at the same time. Apollo flew 3 people. Artemis II flies 4. Spread that additional volume across an extra crew member, and the improvement per person becomes considerably less impressive. Christina Koch has said she was counting on microgravity to make the confined space feel more livable once they were floating free of their seats, because the gravitational neutral environment allows you to use all surfaces of the cabin, not just the floor. She is going to need that psychological adjustment. The countdown reaches 0. The RS-25 main engines ignite first. There is a brief moment, less than a second, of building thrust. Then, the solid rocket boosters ignite and the vehicle lifts off the pad. Nothing in ground-based training fully prepares a crew for this moment. Former astronaut Wendy Lawrence, who flew on 4 shuttle missions, described the experience of launch as having someone sit on your chest, not push against your chest, not press on your chest, but sit on it. A force so heavy and so sustained that lifting your own arm in front of your face becomes a real effort. The Space Launch System is more powerful than the shuttle, and the Artemis II crew will feel approximately 3 times the force of gravity pressing them into their seats as the vehicle accelerates through the lower atmosphere. Their bodies effectively weigh 3 times their normal weight. Breathing takes conscious effort. Moving is nearly impossible. This is called G-loading, and it is one of the most physiologically demanding aspects of launch. Blood is pushed toward the lower extremities. Vision can narrow at sufficiently high G-forces. The cardiovascular system has to work harder to maintain pressure throughout the body. None of the Artemis II crew members will be experiencing this for the first time, as all 4 are experienced astronauts who have flown to the International Space Station, but the profile of a lunar-class launch is different and more demanding than what they have felt before. The vibration from the solid rocket boosters compounds the G-loading. These are not subtle vibrations. They are a deep, bone-level shaking, transmitted through the entire vehicle structure, felt in the teeth, in the chest, in the back of the skull. It does not let up. It continues, unrelenting, for the first 2 minutes of flight. Then, the boosters burn out. Their propellant is exhausted, and they separate from the core stage with a sharp explosive disconnect, tumbling away from the vehicle and eventually splashing into the Atlantic Ocean to be recovered. The moment of separation is immediately noticeable to the crew. The shaking stops. The ride becomes dramatically smoother. The core stage continues to accelerate them upward and downrange, but the worst of the vibration environment is over. Approximately 8 minutes after liftoff, the main engines cut off. Engine cutoff in spaceflight is not like turning off an engine on a car. It is sudden and absolute. One moment, you are being pushed back into your seat by the thrust of 4 engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The next moment, silence. And then something stranger. The crew's arms float upward from their laps. A pencil drifts out of a pocket. A clip drifts away from a checklist. Everything not strapped down lifts gently off whatever surface it was resting on. They are in orbit. Orion is now circling Earth on a highly elliptical path, and for the first time since launch, the crew of Artemis II can look out their windows at the planet below. Orion has 4 windows, modest in size, but positioned to give the crew meaningful views. From their altitude, the curvature of Earth is unmistakable. Not the slight hint of curvature visible from commercial aircraft altitude, but the clear, unambiguous arc of a sphere. The thin blue line of the atmosphere, startlingly thin against the blackness of space, is all that separates 8 billion people from vacuum. Astronauts who see it for the first time consistently describe a visceral shift in how they think about planetary protection, about that atmosphere as a fragile shield rather than an infinite resource. The mission does not race toward the moon immediately after reaching orbit. For the next several hours, Artemis II enters what is called the checkout and verification phase. Wiseman and Glover, along with Koch and Hansen, and the entire team at Mission Control in Houston, go through every major system on the spacecraft, one by one. Life support, propulsion, navigation, communications, thermal control, power generation, waste management, emergency systems, each one checked, verified, confirmed to be operating within expected parameters. This process exists because Orion is about to do something that leaves no margin for critical system failures. Once the crew commits to the translunar trajectory, there is no space station to dock with, no rescue vehicle waiting in orbit, no quick return option. They are genuinely on their own. If a significant problem emerges after translunar injection, the options narrow dramatically. The checkout phase is the last moment to catch problems while Earth is still close and options are still relatively wide. But Artemis II does more than just check systems in orbit. Wiseman and Glover will actually take manual control of the Orion spacecraft, testing its handling characteristics directly. They will perform what NASA calls proximity operations, a series of carefully planned maneuvers using the European Service Module's engines to demonstrate that a human crew can precisely guide Orion through the kinds of close-in procedures that future Artemis missions will require. Those future missions include rendezvous and docking with the Lunar Gateway space station being constructed in lunar orbit, and precise positioning near the lunar surface in preparation for crew transfers to landing vehicles. This is not autopilot test watching. This is a trained pilot with hands on the controls, eyes on instruments, flying a deep space vehicle through demanding maneuver sequences to prove that the machine responds the way the simulation said it would, with humans aboard, in the actual environment of space. The European Service Module, built by Airbus for the European Space Agency, is the component that makes all of this possible. It is bolted to the back end of the Orion Crew Module and performs functions that the capsule itself cannot handle alone. It carries the main propulsion engine and the reaction control thrusters that maneuver the spacecraft. It generates electrical power through 4 large solar array wings that span about 19 meters tip to tip when deployed. It manages the thermal environment, preventing the capsule from overheating on the sun-facing side or freezing on the shadowed side. It carries the water supply and the pressurized gases needed to maintain a breathable atmosphere. Without the service module, Orion is a re-entry vehicle. With it, Orion is a machine capable of traveling to the moon and returning safely. Once checkout is complete and the orbital tests have been performed successfully, the crew prepares for the moment that defines the entire mission: the translunar injection burn. Translunar injection is the engine firing that changes the trajectory from Earth orbit to a path toward the moon. The upper stage of the Space Launch System, which remained attached through orbital operations, fires one final time. It accelerates the spacecraft to the velocity needed to break free of Earth's gravitational dominance and follow a long, curving ballistic path toward the moon. The burn lasts several minutes. When it is complete, the upper stage separates and drifts away, and Orion is alone. 4 people in a capsule, traveling at approximately 39,000 kilometers per hour relative to Earth, on a trajectory that will carry them nearly 400,000 kilometers from home. From this point forward, the spacecraft coasts. The European Service Module's engines provide small course corrections along the way, but the dominant force shaping the trajectory is gravity. Earth's gravity slowing them as they climb, the moon's gravity accelerating them as they approach. The free return trajectory is worth understanding. If the translunar injection burn works as planned and subsequent course corrections go well, Orion will swing around the moon and return to Earth along a path determined by gravitational mechanics. But if the spacecraft's propulsion system fails catastrophically after translunar injection and no further burns can be performed, that same gravitational geometry will still bring the crew home. The moon's gravity will arc the spacecraft around the far side, like a ball swinging around the inside of a bowl, and send it back toward Earth. This was the actual situation faced by the Apollo 13 crew in April 1970. Their service module oxygen tank ruptured, crippling their propulsion system, and the free return trajectory became their survival path. It took nearly 4 days for gravity to bring them home. 4 days during which every decision made by the crew and mission control was oriented toward keeping 3 men alive inside a vehicle that was failing around them. Apollo 13 made it. The free return trajectory saved them. Artemis II has the same option. It is not a reassuring backup. It is a last resort with a 4-day timeline. With the translunar injection complete, the daily rhythm of the outbound journey begins. 4 days of coasting toward the moon. And the experience of that journey is something worth understanding in some detail, because the human reality of it is considerably less glamorous than the engineering achievement. The Earth is shrinking. Every hour, the blue disk in the windows gets slightly smaller. This is not an abstract observation. It is a tangible, psychologically significant experience that every Apollo astronaut who has described it has struggled to fully convey. You are watching your entire world reduce in scale, and you have nothing to compare it to. No one in human history before Apollo had ever experienced leaving Earth at all, and even those astronauts were gone for only a matter of days. The Artemis II crew will watch Earth shrink to a brilliant blue-white dot that can be covered by an outstretched thumb. Everything that has ever existed in human history, every person, every city, every ecosystem, every story, every war, every discovery, compressed behind a single extended finger. The communication delay with Houston increases as they travel. At the distance of the moon, a radio signal takes approximately 1.3 seconds to travel one way. A round-trip conversation therefore has a delay of about 2.6 seconds. This is small enough that real-time conversation remains possible, but large enough to be psychologically noticeable. You ask a question, you wait. The answer comes back a beat late. In an emergency, that delay becomes significant. In routine conversation, it is a constant, subtle reminder that you are not close to home anymore. The interior of the Orion cabin has been reconfigured for the transit. The foot panels from the mission specialist seats have been stowed. Equipment has been rearranged to open up as much usable volume as possible. This kind of reconfiguration reflects a hard reality of spacecraft design. The same volume that must be filled with life support systems, propulsion components, computers, communications gear, food stores, and water during launch and re-entry also has to serve as a living space for 4 human beings during a 10-day journey. Every cubic foot has to do multiple jobs. The toilet system is located under the floor near the main hatch and occupies approximately 5 cubic feet. A privacy curtain provides a minimal separation from the rest of the cabin. For a crew that includes a member who stands 6 feet 2 inches tall, the geometry of this arrangement presents practical daily challenges that engineers spend considerable time optimizing and that no one discusses at press conferences. The waste management system captures urine and vents it overboard into space, where it immediately vaporizes. Solid waste goes into sealed bags that are stored aboard the spacecraft for the duration of the mission and brought back to Earth. There is no sewage processing system on Orion. The mission is short enough that a simpler approach is viable. Water does not get recycled on this mission. Every liter of drinking water and cooking water was loaded onto the spacecraft before launch and stored in tanks within the European service module. The International Space Station uses sophisticated water recovery systems that reclaim water from urine, sweat, and even the moisture in exhaled breath, allowing long-duration missions to remain self-sustaining. Orion does not have those systems. For a 10-day mission, carrying the water is more practical than building the recycling infrastructure. For longer missions to the moon, and eventually to Mars, this calculus changes entirely. Food is packaged in sealed pouches, either freeze-dried and requiring rehydration with water from the dispenser, or thermostabilized and ready to eat at room temperature. A small heating unit is available, but has limited capacity, so many meals are consumed at ambient temperature. The menu was selected by each crew member during food tasting sessions at NASA's Space Food Systems Laboratory in Houston, months before launch. Astronauts get to choose from an approved menu that has been tested for palatability in microgravity, nutritional adequacy, shelf stability, and practical aspects like how much it crumbles, since food crumbs floating around a spacecraft cabin can clog air filters and get into equipment. The Artemis II crew's choices include shrimp cocktail, which has been a consistently popular astronaut meal since Apollo, because the cocktail sauce masks the fact that freeze-dried food often tastes somewhat muted compared to freshly prepared food. Macaroni and cheese, tortillas, which have largely replaced bread in spaceflight because they do not produce crumbs. Jeremy Hansen, the Canadian astronaut, arranged to bring maple-flavored food products and salmon bites, reflecting his national origin. Nobody at NASA has released the complete meal manifest, but the selections reflect both personal preference and the practical realities of eating in a weightless environment. Imagine floating in a metal tube 100,000 kilometers from the nearest restaurant, squeezing lukewarm macaroni from a foil pouch, watching for escaped crumbs, washing it down with water from a pressurized dispenser. That is lunch on Artemis II, prepared by no one, eaten floating, cleaned up with wet wipes. The engineering challenge of keeping 4 humans fed, hydrated, and healthy in deep space sometimes gets lost in the grandeur of the mission's purpose. But it is a real and solved problem, solved by the unglamorous work of food scientists, packaging engineers, and human factors researchers, whose names will never appear in a headline. Sleep follows a carefully managed schedule. 8 hours of rest are blocked into each 24-hour period. though the first day is compressed and crew members may catch sleep in broken intervals. All 4 astronauts sleep simultaneously for most of the mission, in lightweight, hammock-style sleeping bags tethered to the walls of the cabin. There is no dedicated sleep compartment, no door to close, no privacy beyond the curtain over the toilet. The hum of the life support systems is constant. Fans circulate oxygen through the cabin. Scrubbers remove the carbon dioxide exhaled by 4 people in an enclosed space. Thermal control systems move heat around. Together, they make a continuous mechanical sound that experienced space crew members describe as something you eventually stop hearing consciously, and that new crew members spend the first few nights trying to ignore. Carbon dioxide management is more critical than most people realize. In the enclosed volume of the Orion cabin, 4 people exhaling continuously would raise carbon dioxide levels to dangerous concentrations within hours if the scrubbing system failed. The system uses lithium hydroxide canisters to chemically absorb carbon dioxide, a technology with a long heritage in spaceflight going back to the early Apollo era. The Apollo 13 crew famously had to improvise a carbon dioxide scrubber from available materials when their primary systems failed, using a procedure radioed up from engineers on Earth, who had to solve the problem using only components they knew were aboard the crippled spacecraft. Artemis II carries multiple redundant systems and spare canisters. This particular failure mode has been addressed carefully. Exercise is mandatory. 30 minutes every day, every crew member, no exceptions. The exercise device aboard Orion is called a flywheel exerciser, and it lives beneath the side hatch, installed in the same location that serves as the step the crew uses to board the spacecraft on launch day. When not in use as an exerciser, the cover serves as a step. When configured for exercise, it operates like a cable and resistance machine, offering exercises including squats, deadlifts, rows, and cardiovascular movements that can be adapted using different attachment configurations. It can provide up to 400 pounds of resistance load. That sounds substantial, and for 10 days it is adequate. But compared to the exercise facilities aboard the International Space Station, which include multiple machines collectively weighing over 4,000 pounds and occupying 850 cubic feet, the Orion flywheel is a minimal intervention. Station astronauts on 6-month missions need that level of exercise infrastructure to return to Earth in medically acceptable condition. The 2-hour daily exercise regimen on the station is a direct countermeasure against the bone density loss and muscle atrophy that microgravity accelerates aggressively. 10 days in weightlessness will cause measurable changes in the Artemis II crew. Bone density will begin declining, muscle mass will begin reducing, cardiovascular fitness will shift as the heart no longer has to pump blood against gravity. None of these changes will be severe after 10 days. They are reversible with rehabilitation, but they begin almost immediately upon entering weightlessness, which is why the exercise requirement exists, even on a short mission. The body does other strange things in microgravity. Fluid shifts upward toward the head, because without gravity constantly pulling blood and fluids toward the lower body, the cardiovascular system's compensatory mechanisms keep pumping, and the net result is a persistent headward fluid shift. The crew members' faces will look slightly puffy. Their nasal passages will feel congested, similar to the feeling of hanging upside down, but constant and unavoidable. Their sense of smell may be slightly impaired, which partly explains why astronauts consistently report that food tastes less flavorful in orbit than it does on the ground. The neural adaptations that begin with this fluid shift take several days to reach a new equilibrium, and during that adjustment period, some crew members experience something called space motion sickness, which closely resembles severe car sickness and which is managed with medication when necessary. Hygiene operates at absolute minimum. There are no showers on Orion. The crew cleans themselves with wet wipes, liquid soap, and dry shampoo. Personal hygiene kits contain toothbrushes, razors, and hairbrushes. You brush your teeth with a special swallowable toothpaste, or spit into a wet wipe. You shave with a specially designed razor that captures whiskers. You clean yourself at a small designated area near the toilet, in full awareness that your crewmates are less than 10 feet away in a shared space with no real partition. Privacy is a social convention on this mission, not a spatial reality. The crew trains together for months, precisely because being comfortable with each other under those conditions requires familiarity that cannot be faked. Communications with Earth are managed through a combination of handheld microphones, communications headsets, and an integrated system that supports both voice calls with mission control and video calls with families. The crew will carry tablets and laptops loaded with technical procedures and, notably, personal entertainment they selected before launch. The exact content of those personal files is considered private, and NASA does not publish crew manifests of movies and music. But it is not difficult to imagine that a 10-day journey provides time for reading, watching films, listening to music, and the kind of sustained private reflection that ordinary life on Earth rarely permits. 4 days after translunar injection, the moon begins to grow in the windows. It starts as a disk distinguishable from the stars, only by its apparent movement relative to the background of the galaxy, then grows slowly into something with visible surface texture, then into something vast and detailed and close. And this is the moment when Artemis II stops being primarily an engineering test and becomes something else. These 4 people will see the far side of the moon with their own eyes. No human being has done that since the crew of Apollo 17 in December of 1972. More precisely, no human has seen the lunar far side with their own eyes from a position as close as Artemis II will achieve. The spacecraft will pass approximately 7,400 kilometers beyond the moon's far side, farther from Earth than any crewed spacecraft has traveled in history. The previous distance record was set under emergency circumstances by Apollo 13, when that crippled spacecraft had to loop around the far side on its free return trajectory. Artemis II will travel even farther from Earth by a meaningful margin, setting a new record for human distance from home. At maximum distance, the crew will be approximately 450,000 kilometers from Earth. Earth as seen from that distance will appear as a bright blue-white point of light, small enough to cover with an outstretched thumb. The cognitive and emotional impact of that view is something astronauts have struggled to fully articulate. The Apollo astronauts described it using terms like humbling and terrifying and profoundly lonely. The crew of Apollo 8, who first saw the full Earth hanging in space above the lunar horizon in December of 1968, generated perhaps the most famous photographs in the history of human exploration. The Earthrise image taken by William Anders during that mission has been credited with helping spark the modern environmental movement because, for the first time in human history, there was a photograph that showed people what their planet actually looked like from outside it. Small, fragile, alone. Artemis II will carry people farther from that blue dot than any human since. The far side of the moon presents a scientifically distinct landscape from the near side. The hemisphere that always faces away from Earth, kept permanently hidden until spacecraft began flying around the moon in the 1960s, is dramatically different from the familiar face we see from Earth. The near side has large dark basaltic plains called maria, formed by ancient volcanic flooding that filled large impact basins. The far side has far fewer maria. Its crust is substantially thicker, by roughly 10 to 15 kilometers on average, and it is more heavily cratered, bearing evidence of a more violent bombardment history. The reason for this asymmetry between the hemispheres is still an active area of lunar science. Some hypotheses involve early heat distribution patterns in the lunar interior. Others propose a connection to the dynamics of the early solar system. The data gathered during Artemis II, including photographs, spectral measurements, and radiation environment data from the far side, will contribute to narrowing down these explanations. Radiation is a constant and serious concern throughout the mission, but especially beyond Earth's protective magnetic field. At the surface of the Earth, and within low Earth orbit, the planet's magnetosphere deflects a large fraction of the high-energy particles streaming through the solar system. Cosmic rays from outside the solar system and energetic particles ejected by the sun are largely turned aside before they reach us. When you leave the protection of that magnetic field, the rules change fundamentally. Galactic cosmic rays are high-energy particles, mostly protons and heavier atomic nuclei, that originate from outside the solar system and arrive at Earth from all directions at essentially all times. They cannot be practically shielded against with reasonable spacecraft mass. A shield thick enough to stop high-energy cosmic rays would weigh so much it would be unfeasible to launch. The standard approach in current spacecraft design is to accept a certain level of cosmic ray exposure, monitor it carefully, and minimize the total duration of exposure. The walls of the Orion spacecraft provide partial shielding, reducing dose rates compared to completely unshielded exposure, but not eliminating them. Solar energetic particles are a different threat. These are particles, again mostly protons, ejected from the sun during solar flares and the associated events called coronal mass ejections. A large solar energetic particle event can deliver a significant radiation dose in a matter of hours to days. Unlike galactic cosmic rays, solar energetic particle events are episodic and to some extent forecastable. NASA maintains a space weather monitoring infrastructure precisely to provide warning of large solar particle events. Orion has designated shelter areas for solar particle events. The most shielded locations in the capsule are the storage bays, where packed equipment and supplies provide additional material between the crew and space, and the area near the toilet under the floor. In the event of a significant solar particle event, the crew shelters in the most shielded available location and waits for the particle flux to decrease. This is not a glamorous contingency plan. It is the honest answer to the question of how you protect humans in deep space from energetic solar radiation, given current technology. You pile material around them, and you wait it out. NASA's space weather forecasting teams have been running continuous analyses in preparation for Artemis II, aware that the mission coincides with a period of elevated solar activity. The Sun follows an approximately 11-year cycle of activity, with solar maximum representing the peak of sunspot activity and the highest frequency of flares and coronal mass ejections. Recent measurements indicate the Sun has been in an active period, which makes solar particle event probability higher than during solar minimum. The forecasting teams can provide roughly 1 to 3 days of warning for major events, based on observations of active regions on the solar surface and early detection of outgoing particle streams. That warning window, while imperfect, is usually enough to alert the crew and have them positioned in the most shielded areas before peak particle flux arrives. After the lunar flyby, gravity takes over. Orion swings around the far side of the moon and begins its long arc back toward Earth. This gravitational assist requires no engine burn. The moon's gravity curves the trajectory, adds some velocity, and sends the spacecraft outbound on a path that arcs away from the moon and back toward Earth, like a stone slung by a slingshot. The return journey takes approximately 4 to 5 days. During those days, the crew continues its mission documentation work. They are the first humans to provide real-time feedback on how Orion handles deep space conditions with people aboard. Their observations, measurements, and subjective reports feed directly into the design and planning process for future Artemis missions. How does the cabin temperature feel after 5 full days? Do the sleeping bags keep a floating person stable enough for restful sleep? Does the carbon dioxide scrubber maintain air quality adequately when all 4 crew members are active simultaneously? How do the suits feel after extended wearing? What adjustments would the crew recommend for the next mission? These data points are not obtainable through any other means. Simulations approximate the conditions. Unmanned test flights measure physical parameters, but the qualitative, subjective experience of living inside this machine for 10 days can only be reported by the humans who lived it. As Earth grows larger in the windows and the return trajectory converges with the planet, the crew begins preparing for the most technically demanding and arguably most dangerous phase of the entire mission: re-entry. The story of the Artemis I heat shield deserves to be told in detail because it is directly relevant to what the Artemis II crew is trusting with their lives. In November 2022, the Artemis I mission flew the uncrewed Orion spacecraft on a 25-day journey around the moon and back. It was the first integrated test of the complete Space Launch System and Orion system, and from all external appearances, it went extremely well. The spacecraft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on target. Recovery operations went smoothly. Cabin temperatures had never exceeded design limits during re-entry. The telemetry data looked nominal. When engineers brought the returned capsule into their facilities and began detailed inspection of the heat shield, they found something they had not expected. In over 100 distinct locations, the ablative heat shield material, a substance called avcoat, had experienced cracking and uncontrolled material loss. This was not the smooth, controlled erosion that the design intended. Avcoat works by absorbing thermal energy and then burning away in a controlled fashion, taking that absorbed heat with it. This process is called ablation, and it is the same basic principle used by meteor entry into Earth's atmosphere. The outer surface chars and burns, and the gas generated by that process carries heat energy away from the surface. If it works correctly, the material closest to the capsule structure stays well below structural limits even while the outer surface experiences plasma temperatures. What the engineers found instead was jagged, irregular chunks of material that had cracked and detached in patterns inconsistent with controlled ablation. 4 separation bolts embedded in the heat shield structure had also shown unexpected thermal effects, with localized deep erosion in areas where the design predicted normal char patterns. The investigation took nearly 2 years. The findings were complex and interrelated. The root mechanism was identified as gas entrapment. During re-entry, the avcoat material generates gases as it heats and ablates. In the Artemis I flight profile, those gases were produced faster than they could escape through the material. Pressure built up within the heat shield. That internal pressure cracked the material and blew pieces off in irregular chunks. The conditions that led to this were traced in part to the specific re-entry trajectory used on Artemis I. That mission used a technique called skip entry. Rather than entering the atmosphere on a single, continuous descent path, the capsule dipped into the upper atmosphere, decelerated enough to release significant heat energy into the shield, then actually bounced back out of the atmosphere into space briefly, before re-entering on a second pass for the final descent to splashdown. This skip maneuver is used because it allows the spacecraft to manage deceleration forces on the crew and to land at a specific target location, rather than wherever a direct ballistic trajectory would put it. The problem was that the pause between atmospheric contacts, the time when the capsule was back in space between the first and second atmospheric passes, allowed heat to accumulate within the shield material, without the continuous ablation process that would normally carry it away. The material had absorbed heat but had not yet fully processed it, and when re-entry resumed, the conditions were different from what the material experienced during nominal single-pass entry. Gases formed at rates the material structure could not accommodate, and the shield fractured. The ground testing infrastructure had not caught this behavior because the testing facilities used heating rates higher than what the spacecraft actually experienced in flight. At those higher heating rates, the material behaved as the models predicted it would. The specific combination of moderate sustained heating, followed by a pause, and then a second moderate heating episode, was not well represented in the pre-flight testing matrix. This is a fundamental challenge in aerospace development. You can only test for the conditions you anticipate, and the actual flight environment always contains conditions you did not fully anticipate. NASA's response to this finding was carefully considered. They did not replace the avcoat material with a different ablative compound. Avcoat has a long qualification history going back to the Apollo program, and its properties are well understood. Instead, they changed what had actually caused the cracking, the trajectory. Artemis II will enter the atmosphere on a direct, steeper, continuous descent path with no skip. One uninterrupted plunge from the top of the sensible atmosphere to splashdown. This eliminates the thermal pause that allowed gas accumulation to build to cracking pressure in the Artemis I shield. The engineering trade-off is that a steeper direct entry produces higher deceleration forces on the crew. When you enter more steeply, you slow down faster, and slowing down faster means higher G-loading during the terminal phase of descent. The crew of Artemis II will experience greater G-forces during re-entry than they would have under the skip trajectory that Artemis I used. This is a known and accepted consequence. The crew has trained for it. It is within the physiological limits of healthy astronauts. But it is one more physical demand added to the list. Orion will contact the upper atmosphere at approximately 40,000 kilometers per hour. This is Mach 32, meaning 32 times the speed of sound. To put that in physical terms, the kinetic energy of the spacecraft at that speed is enormous, and all of it has to be converted to heat and then managed before the vehicle can reach landing speeds. The mechanism for that energy conversion is the interaction of air molecules with the capsule's blunt forward face. At those velocities, the air in front of the spacecraft cannot move out of the way fast enough. It is compressed so violently that the molecules transfer kinetic energy into thermal energy almost instantaneously, creating a sheath of superheated ionized gas, a plasma, that envelops the capsule. The temperature of this plasma reaches approximately 2,760 degrees Celsius. To frame that number concretely, the surface of the Sun has a temperature of approximately 5,500 degrees Celsius. The plasma surrounding the Orion capsule during re-entry is roughly half the temperature of the Sun's surface. Between the crew and that plasma are a few inches of avcoat resin-coated silica ablative material on the heat shield, plus the aluminum and composite structural walls of the capsule itself. On the far side of those materials, in the crew cabin, the astronauts should be experiencing comfortable ambient temperatures. This is not a comfortable margin. This is the result of extremely careful engineering, extensive testing, and the particular properties of ablative heat shield technology. But comfort and margin are different things, and anyone who thinks about the numbers clearly understands that re-entry is the moment when the accumulated quality of all the engineering either holds or it does not. Inside the cabin, the crew feels the G-forces build as deceleration increases. It starts gently as the atmosphere thickens, then builds steadily into a crushing force that compresses them into their seats. Breathing requires sustained effort. Their vision may narrow slightly if the G-loading is high enough. The windows glow orange, then white, as plasma wraps around the capsule and the heat shield begins doing the job it was designed for. Communications black out. The plasma that envelops the capsule is electrically conductive and blocks radio signals in the frequency bands used for spacecraft communications. For several minutes, Mission Control has no contact with the crew. No voice, no telemetry, no confirmation that anything is happening the way it was supposed to happen. The crew of Artemis II is completely alone. No voice from Houston, no data connection, no external input. Just the mounting pressure of deceleration, the orange glow beyond the windows, and the sound of superheated gas being processed by the heat shield into something survivable. When the capsule slows below supersonic speeds, a pair of drogue parachutes deploy from the top of the capsule. These are smaller parachutes designed not to stop the descent, but to stabilize it, orienting the capsule into the correct attitude for main parachute deployment, and slowing the vehicle into a speed regime where the main chutes can function safely. Shortly after, 3 large main parachutes billow open above the Pacific Ocean near San Diego. The capsule descends at several meters per second. Splashdown is not gentle. The water surface is hard at those velocities, and the impact is felt sharply throughout the structure. The capsule bobs in the ocean swells as a U.S. Navy recovery team aboard an amphibious transport vessel closes in. Divers enter the water and attach flotation collars to stabilize the capsule. The vehicle is secured with tow lines, winched up a ramp onto the deck of the recovery ship, and the hatch is opened. 4 people breathe unfiltered outdoor air for the first time in 10 days. Their legs will not work properly immediately. After 10 days in microgravity, the musculoskeletal system has partially adapted to the absence of gravity's constant demand. The cardiovascular system has shifted its fluid distribution. The inner ear's balance sensors have recalibrated to an environment without a consistent gravitational reference. Standing upright will require conscious effort and concentration. Walking will feel unsteady. The crew will be supported by medical personnel and gradually transition to standing, sitting, and then assisted walking over the course of the recovery operations. This physical readaptation is temporary. Within days to weeks, depending on the individual, the body recalibrates back to terrestrial conditions. But the immediate post-splashdown period is a genuine medical transition, not just a formality. The crew will be monitored closely, their vital signs measured, their cognitive status assessed, their cardiovascular responses tracked as they re-enter one gravity after 10 days of weightlessness. What Artemis II achieves, assuming it succeeds, is something that cannot be fully measured in technical specifications. 450,000 kilometers from Earth, the farthest any humans have traveled in over 50 years. 10 days of continuous data collection on human performance in deep space. Verification that the Orion spacecraft and Space Launch System work as a functioning crewed deep space transport system. Proof that the heat shield fix derived from the Artemis I findings is sound. And a practical demonstration that the United States, in partnership with its International Space Agency partners, has rebuilt the capability to send human beings to the moon. There is something almost paradoxical about the way this mission works. 4 people living in a space roughly the size of a family minivan, eating freeze-dried shrimp from foil pouches, sleeping in tethered bags on the walls, cleaning themselves with wet wipes, exercising on a resistance device the size of carry-on luggage, while simultaneously traveling to the farthest point from Earth any human has ever reached in more than half a century. The technology is sophisticated beyond what any previous generation could have imagined, and the daily lived experience is modest to the point of austerity. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The heat shield that they are trusting with their lives cracked the last time it was used. That is not a sensationalized claim. It is the documented finding from the Artemis I investigation, published by NASA and reviewed extensively by the engineering community. The fix is also documented, analyzed, and as thoroughly tested as the constraints of pre-flight testing allow. Whether the fix is sufficient will be confirmed by the performance of that shield during the descent of Artemis II. The crew knows this. They have attended every briefing. They have seen the photographs of the cracked material. They have asked the engineers the hardest questions they could formulate and have evaluated the answers carefully, and they chose to fly. This is the nature of exploration at the boundary of what engineering currently makes possible. Every mission beyond Earth orbit throughout history has been, at its core, a calculated bet. Apollo 13 demonstrated what happens when the bet goes wrong in ways that were not fully anticipated. Columbia and Challenger demonstrated it at a level of tragedy that changed how the entire space program thinks about risk. Each of those losses prompted years of investigation, redesign, and reassessment. Each one was followed, eventually, by a return to flight that incorporated the lessons learned, imperfectly but sincerely. Artemis II carries the accumulated lessons of all of that history and adds the specific lesson of the cracked avcoat. The engineers changed the trajectory instead of the material. Mission planners adjusted the re-entry profile to eliminate the conditions that caused the failure. The risk has been analyzed and a response has been implemented. Whether that response is complete and sufficient is the question that only flight will answer. What happens after Artemis II, if it succeeds, is the beginning of a sustained return to human presence beyond Earth orbit. Artemis III is targeted to include an actual lunar surface landing, the first since Apollo 17. Subsequent missions would establish the groundwork for a semi-permanent human presence in cislunar space, the region of space between Earth and the Moon, potentially centered on the Lunar Gateway Station being assembled in a near rectilinear halo orbit around the Moon. The gateway will serve as a staging point for lunar surface operations, a communications relay for missions to the lunar South Pole region, and eventually as a stepping stone for missions to more distant destinations. The lunar South Pole is scientifically different from the equatorial regions where the Apollo missions landed. The polar regions contain permanently shadowed craters that have not seen direct sunlight for billions of years. These craters, because they sit in perpetual shadow at the bottom of deep depressions, are among the coldest places in the inner solar system. Temperatures in the most shadowed regions fall below 150 degrees Celsius, below zero. At those temperatures, water ice is stable for geological timescales, and orbital observations have confirmed the presence of water ice in the permanently shadowed regions of both the lunar north and south poles. This ice is scientifically interesting as a record of the early solar system, as it may contain material delivered by comets and asteroids billions of years ago, and it is practically important as a potential resource. Of a streetland be split into hydrogen and oxygen, which are rocket propellants. An in-situ water source at the lunar poles could reduce the cost of sustained lunar operations dramatically by eliminating the need to launch propellant from Earth for every mission. The radiation environment data gathered during Artemis II will be directly applicable to planning for these longer lunar surface operations. Understanding the solar energetic particle event frequency and intensity at lunar distance, combined with the specific shielding performance of the Orion habitation area, gives mission planners better tools for assessing the radiation exposure of crews on extended surface stays. Lunar surface habitats will need radiation shelter capability, and the data from Artemis II helps quantify what that capability needs to be. Human physiology at lunar distance remains incompletely understood. The Artemis II mission produces data on sleep quality, cardiovascular health, bone and muscle changes, cognitive performance, radiation biomarkers, and dozens of other physiological parameters in 4 individuals over 10 days at distances never before studied with human subjects. This data becomes part of the research foundation for planning longer missions, including eventually crewed missions to Mars that would expose crew members to similar radiation environments for periods of months rather than days. The question of what exactly the 4 Artemis II crew members will take away from their experience personally is one that only they can answer, and only after they have returned. But the precedent of Apollo astronauts, who have spoken about their experiences in the decades since those missions, suggests that the cognitive and emotional impact of viewing Earth from that distance is substantial and lasting. Multiple Apollo astronauts described a shift in how they perceived the concept of national borders and political divisions after seeing Earth as a single, undivided object from space. This phenomenon has been discussed in psychological literature as the overview effect, a cognitive shift in awareness that some people experience when they see Earth from space and perceive it as a small, fragile, and unified system rather than as the vast, politically divided, and apparently inexhaustible resource it tends to seem from the surface. Whether the Artemis II crew will experience the overview effect is an individual question. Whether their accounts of the far side of the Moon, of Earth reduced to a bright point of light, of the utter silence of deep space beyond the hum of life support machinery, will shape how the next generation of humans understands its place in the solar system is a question the mission itself will begin to answer. What science does not yet know about human performance in deep space beyond Earth's magnetic field remains substantial. 10 days provides a first data point. not a complete picture. The physiological changes that begin in the first days of spaceflight continue to evolve over weeks and months. The radiation exposure accumulated in 10 days is manageable. The exposure accumulated over a 6-month Mars transit is a different and more serious problem, one that current shielding technology cannot fully address. Research into pharmacological countermeasures, improved shielding materials, and biological approaches to radiation resistance is ongoing at multiple institutions globally. Artemis II does not solve that problem, but it adds specific measured data from the actual deep space radiation environment to the research base. The spacecraft design itself will be refined based on Artemis II findings. Crew observations about the livability of the Orion cabin, the adequacy of the exercise equipment, the performance of the sleep system, the effectiveness of the food supply, and dozens of other human factors details will inform changes to Artemis III and subsequent missions. This iterative design process, in which each mission teaches lessons that improve the next, is how spaceflight has always progressed. The early Mercury missions were essentially test flights of the concept of human spaceflight. Gemini developed operational techniques and tested hardware needed for Apollo. Apollo built the lunar capability step by step across 12 missions before landing humans on the moon. Artemis is following the same developmental logic, with Artemis I as the unmanned systems test, Artemis II as the first crewed operational validation, and Artemis III as the first landing attempt. The international dimension of Artemis II is also worth noting. The European service module that powers Orion is a European Space Agency contribution built by Airbus. Jeremy Hansen is a Canadian Space Agency astronaut, the first non-American to travel toward the moon. This is not incidental to the mission's design. The Artemis program is structured as an international partnership, with multiple space agencies contributing hardware, personnel, and funding in exchange for crew slots and scientific access. The Lunar Gateway, that will serve as a staging point for later missions, includes contributions from the European Space Agency, the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency. This distributed approach reflects a broader evolution in how major space infrastructure is built and operated, moving away from the predominantly national model of Apollo toward a model in which deep space capability is shared among multiple spacefaring nations. When the hatch opens on the recovery ship and 4 people breathe outdoor air for the first time in 10 days, the mission will have either confirmed or challenged every assumption that went into the Artemis II design. It will have produced a body of data that researchers will analyze for years. It will have set a new record for human distance from Earth. It will have tested a new trajectory designed to address a cracking heat shield. And it will have demonstrated that human beings can leave Earth's gravitational neighborhood, travel to the moon and back, and return safely. That demonstration, simple as it sounds, is not a trivial achievement. The engineers and astronauts who accomplish it will have done something that no human being has done in more than 50 years. And what they learn in the process will determine how soon and how sustainably humanity establishes a lasting presence beyond the planet where every member of our species has lived for the entirety of recorded history. The door that closed in December of 1972, when the crew of Apollo 17 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, has been edging open for years through uncrewed missions, orbital operations, and the gradual assembly of new hardware. Artemis II is the mission that opens it wide enough for humans to step through again. What lies beyond that door? What science will be done? What resources will be found? What engineering will be developed? What understanding will be gained? Is not known. That is precisely why they are going. To fully appreciate what Artemis II represents, it helps to understand the complete arc of why it took 53 years to return humans to this trajectory in the first place. The story involves far more than technology. It involves funding cycles, political will, shifting national priorities, near misses, tragedies, and the slow rebuilding of institutional capability that was partly dismantled after Apollo ended. When the Apollo program concluded in 1972, NASA had the Saturn V rocket, the Command and Service Module, the Lunar Module, the Mission Operations Experience, and the trained personnel required to keep sending humans to the moon. None of that capability was preserved. The Saturn V production line was shut down. The remaining rockets were turned into museum exhibits. The workforce that built and operated the system dispersed into industry and retirement. The institutional knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how to build and fly those systems safely, began to fade as the people who held it moved on. This was a deliberate decision, driven by the economic and political realities of the 1970s. The Vietnam War had consumed enormous national resources. Domestic spending priorities were reshaping the federal budget. The space program's budget, which had reached roughly 4% of the federal budget at Apollo's peak in the mid-1960s, declined sharply after the moon landings demonstrated that the United States had won the space race competition with the Soviet Union. Without that competitive pressure, the political will to sustain the pace and cost of lunar exploration was not sufficient to survive the changed budget environment. The space shuttle program, which followed Apollo, was designed with different goals. Rather than exploring deep space, the shuttle was optimized for access to low Earth orbit at high frequency and, theoretically, low cost per launch. The cost model never worked as intended. The shuttle proved far more expensive to operate than projected. But it did give NASA a human spaceflight capability that it maintained for 30 years, from 1981 through 2011. During those 30 years, humans reached the International Space Station, serviced the Hubble Space Telescope, conducted extensive microgravity science, and developed sophisticated operational expertise in orbital environments. But no human traveled beyond low Earth orbit. The moon, 100 times farther away than the space station, might as well have been on another planet in terms of operational capability. The technical challenges of returning to lunar distance are substantially greater than they might appear from a surface-level comparison. The space launch system, required to reach translunar trajectory, must generate far more total energy than the rockets used to reach the International Space Station. A spacecraft on its way to the station is accelerated to roughly 28,000 kilometers per hour relative to Earth's surface and needs to maintain that speed to stay in orbit. A spacecraft heading to the moon must reach nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour just to escape Earth's gravitational dominance and begin the ballistic coast outward. That velocity difference, though it seems modest in percentage terms, represents a very large difference in required propulsive energy. The life support requirements scale differently too. A station crew can receive resupply missions every few months, can transfer personnel by undocking a crew vehicle and docking a fresh one, and can in principle abandon the station temporarily if a severe emergency makes that necessary. A crew beyond Earth orbit has none of these options. Every consumable they need for the entire mission must be aboard at launch. Every contingency must be anticipated and planned for with onboard resources. The spacecraft is entirely self-contained, and the communication delay, even at the moon's modest distance, means that emergency problem-solving has to be largely autonomous. Mission control can advise. It cannot directly intervene. Orion's development reflects these requirements. The capsule has an independent abort system, a tower structure topped with solid rocket motors that can pull the crew capsule away from a failing launch vehicle in a fraction of a second. This launch abort system is derived from lessons learned from studying the Challenger disaster of 1986, where a crew escape system could potentially have saved the 7-person crew if it had been available during the solid booster failure that destroyed that vehicle. Orion's abort system can fire at any point during ascent, from the moment of launch through well into the atmospheric phase of flight, protecting the crew against a range of potential launch vehicle failures. The thermal protection system that covers the blunt bottom face of the capsule, the Avcoat heat shield, is the descendant of the original Apollo heat shield material. This is not nostalgia. Avcoat was chosen because it has a known and well-documented performance history across multiple Apollo re-entries from lunar distance, and because that documentation provides a validated reference for thermal modeling. When engineers build computational models of how the heat shield will perform, they can compare their model predictions against the actual Apollo flight data to verify that the models are capturing the physics correctly. Starting with a material whose behavior is already tied to real flight data is more reliable than introducing a novel material whose performance in the actual flight environment is entirely model dependent. The cracking problem found on Artemis I was not a failure of the material selection. It was a failure of the interaction between the specific trajectory used and a gas venting behavior of the material that the testing procedures had not adequately characterized for that particular combination of conditions. The material did not fail. The characterization of how the material would behave under a specific unusual thermal loading sequence was incomplete. This distinction matters because it directed the response. Rather than switching to a different material with unknown behavior, the engineering team addressed the specific thermal loading sequence by changing the trajectory. This kind of failure analysis and iterative refinement is the normal process of aerospace engineering development, though it is rarely as visible to the public as it has been in this case, because NASA chose to be transparent about the finding and the investigation. The Apollo program experienced heat shield anomalies during development, though the specific problems were different in character. The Space Shuttle program's thermal protection system, the ceramic tiles that covered the orbiter, experienced damage and loss events throughout the program's life, some of which contributed to the Columbia disaster of 2003, when damage to the leading edge of the left wing during launch allowed superheated atmospheric gas to enter the wing structure during re-entry and destroy the vehicle. The shuttle program's response included improved inspection techniques, a repair toolkit for use by crew members during on-orbit operations, and enhanced pre-flight imaging systems to detect tile damage before re-entry. Each failure, analyzed thoroughly, produced changes that the next missions incorporated. Artemis II is the product of that entire accumulated engineering tradition. The specific response to the Artemis I heat shield finding is one element of it. The broader design philosophy of the Orion spacecraft, with its conservative material choices, its abort system, its redundant life support, its crew communications infrastructure, and its radiation monitoring systems, reflects decades of lessons about what kills people in space and how to prevent it. The astronauts themselves are the other half of the safety equation. All 4 members of the Artemis II crew are experienced spaceflight professionals with station missions on their records. Reed Wiseman flew a 6-month expedition to the International Space Station and served as its commander. Victor Glover spent 6 months on the station during the first operational Crew Dragon mission in 2020 and 2021. Christina Koch spent 328 consecutive days on the station, a record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, during which she performed spacewalks, conducted extensive science, and experienced the full spectrum of physiological adaptation that long-duration spaceflight produces. Jeremy Hansen is the least experienced of the crew in terms of actual spaceflight time, having not yet flown to space before Artemis II, but he has trained for years within the astronaut corps, participated in extensive Orion-specific simulations, and brings the rigorous, technical background of a Canadian Forces test pilot. The combination of their individual experience and their team-level training is itself a system that mission planners have optimized. Astronaut crews selected for high-stakes missions are chosen not only for individual competence, but for how they function as a team under stress. The interpersonal dynamics of 4 people confined in a small space for 10 days under conditions of physical discomfort, radiation exposure, communication delay, and the constant psychological weight of distance from Earth is not a trivial factor in mission success. NASA's astronaut selection and training process, refined across 60 years of human spaceflight, attempts to identify and select individuals who combine technical excellence with psychological resilience and the specific interpersonal qualities that allow a small team to function effectively under sustained stress. The history of long-duration spaceflight has examples of crew dynamics influencing mission outcomes in meaningful ways. Relationships within crews on long-station expeditions have at times required active management by mission controllers. The isolation, the confined space, the distance from home, and the sustained stress of living and working in a high-stakes environment create interpersonal pressures that are real and that require conscious management. 10 days is short enough that these dynamics are unlikely to become severe, but they are not absent. The crew's months of training together before the mission are partly about building the mutual understanding and communication habits that allow small problems to be addressed before they become larger ones. Understanding the orbital mechanics of the Artemis II trajectory provides context for why the mission is designed the way it is. After translunar injection, Orion does not fly in a straight line to the moon. The spacecraft follows a ballistic arc through a gravitational field shaped by both Earth and the moon. As the spacecraft moves away from Earth, Earth's gravity decelerates it continuously. At a certain distance, a point called the Lagrange point 1, between Earth and the moon, the gravitational pulls of Earth and the moon are approximately balanced, and beyond that point, the moon's gravity begins to dominate. The spacecraft accelerates toward the moon as it descends into the moon's gravitational well. The approach trajectory is designed to take the spacecraft behind the moon's far side, which serves multiple purposes. It allows the mission to achieve the record-setting distance from Earth. It allows the crew to observe the far side directly, and the geometry of swinging around behind the moon naturally sets up the gravity assist that provides some of the energy for the return trajectory. The European Service Module engine performs a small burn near closest approach to refine the trajectory, ensuring the outbound and return paths are what the mission plan requires. The near rectilinear halo orbit being used for the lunar gateway the orbit that future Artemis missions will use as a staging point, is a dynamically interesting trajectory. It is not a simple circular or elliptical orbit around the moon. It is a three-dimensional path that exploits the complex gravitational interactions between Earth, the moon, and the sun to maintain a stable orbit that comes relatively close to the lunar surface at one point in its cycle and extends relatively far from the moon at another point. This kind of orbit, sometimes called a quasi-periodic orbit, because it is not perfectly repeating due to the continuous gravitational perturbations from multiple bodies, requires much less propulsive energy to maintain than a comparable circular orbit at similar average distance. This makes it energetically advantageous as a staging location. Artemis II does not visit this orbit. The mission flies past the moon on its free return trajectory without entering lunar orbit. But the data gathered during the flyby, combined with the system verification data gathered throughout the mission, feeds directly into the planning for Artemis III and the gateway missions that follow. Every Artemis mission builds on the one before it, and the entire program is designed as a staged capability development rather than a series of independent expeditions. The science objectives of Artemis II, while secondary to the primary mission of crew and system verification, are real. The crew carries instruments to measure the radiation environment at lunar distance. They will photograph the lunar surface, particularly the far side, in higher resolution and from perspectives that differ from any previous mission. The specific visual conditions during Artemis II, the orbital geometry, the sun angle, the lighting conditions, will not be replicated by any other mission. Images and spectral data gathered during this specific approach will document the lunar surface under conditions unique to this mission. The far side observations are particularly valuable because the far side is scientifically underobserved relative to the near side. Most lunar science, including all of the Apollo sample returns, has come from the near side. The Apollo landing sites were all on the near side, chosen in part because continuous communication with Earth is only possible from the near side, since the moon blocks all radio signals from the far side. To reach the far side, future missions will need communication relay satellites in lunar orbit, which is partly the role the Lunar Gateway will serve. Until those assets are in place, the far side remains accessible only from flyby trajectories like the one Artemis II is flying. The asymmetry between the hemispheres provides a window into the early history of the moon itself. The moon formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago, likely from material ejected when a Mars-sized protoplanet called Theia collided with the early Earth in a glancing impact. The ejected material coalesced in Earth orbit and accumulated into the moon over a period estimated at tens of millions of years. In its early history, the moon was largely molten, covered in a magma ocean that took hundreds of millions of years to solidify. As it cooled, differentiation occurred. Heavier materials sank and lighter materials rose, producing the layered internal structure the moon has today, with a small iron core, a mantle, and a crust. The Maria, the dark plains visible on the lunar near side, formed later, between roughly 3 billion and 4 billion years ago, when volcanic activity flooded large impact basins with basaltic lava. This activity was significantly more pronounced on the near side than on the far side. The reason for this asymmetry is one of the outstanding questions in lunar science. One hypothesis is that the near side crust is thinner, making it easier for volcanic material to reach the surface. Another is that radioactive elements are concentrated in the near side's crust, providing extra heat that drove extended volcanic activity. Orbital measurements of thorium and uranium distribution across the lunar surface support the second hypothesis to some extent, but the full explanation remains uncertain. Far side observations that constrain the thickness and composition of the far side crust, the kind of data that Artemis II can contribute, are directly relevant to testing these models. The permanently shadowed craters near the lunar poles represent a different kind of scientific resource. These cold traps have collected and preserved volatile materials over billions of years. In addition to water ice, which has been confirmed by multiple orbital missions, these regions may contain other frozen volatiles, including carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, ammonia, and other compounds that are unstable on warmer surfaces. These materials are essentially a chemical archive of the early solar system, preserved at extreme temperatures in the absence of any geological process that would have altered or destroyed them. Analyzing these deposits, which will require future surface missions with sample return capability, could provide insights into the composition of the early solar nebula and the sources of Earth's own water. The question of where Earth's water came from is one of the major open questions in planetary science. Earth formed in a region of the inner solar system where temperatures during planetary formation were high enough that water should have been largely excluded from the building materials. Yet Earth has vast quantities of water. The leading hypothesis is that water was delivered to Earth after its formation by comets and asteroids from the colder outer solar system, a process called late-stage bombardment. If the polar ice deposits on the Moon contain preserved material from this period, analyzing their isotopic composition could help determine whether lunar water came from the same sources as Earth's water. This would significantly constrain models of solar system formation and evolution. All of this science builds from the foundation that Artemis II is helping to establish. The mission's primary purpose is verification and demonstration, but the scientific return is real and cumulative. Each step in the Artemis program unlocks access to the next tier of scientific investigation. The technological developments being driven by the Artemis program extend beyond spaceflight itself. The life support systems being refined for deep space use have direct applications in closed environment life support on Earth, including in remote locations, submarines, and potentially in terrestrial situations requiring air and water management in confined spaces. The radiation biology research being pursued in connection with Artemis crewed missions contributes to the broader field of radiation medicine, with applications in cancer treatment and in understanding the long-term health effects of radiation exposure. Navigation technologies developed for autonomous deep space operations. The systems that allow Orion to determine its precise position and velocity relative to Earth, the Moon, and the Sun using combinations of radio ranging, optical measurements, and inertial navigation are advancing the general field of autonomous navigation in environments where GPS and terrestrial reference systems are unavailable. These technologies are relevant to future planetary missions, to the eventual navigation of crewed vehicles in the Mars system, and potentially to a wide range of robotic and autonomous systems that operate in environments without external positioning infrastructure. The thermal protection materials being developed and tested through the Artemis program, including efforts to improve on Avcoat's performance based on the lessons of the Artemis I inspection, contribute to a broader catalog of high-temperature materials with applications in hypersonic vehicle design, atmospheric entry vehicles for other planets, and potentially in energy systems that require materials capable of sustained exposure to extreme temperatures. It is a pattern repeated throughout the history of exploration-driven technology development. The engineering challenges of reaching an extremely demanding destination force innovations that turn out to have broad applicability. The space program has a well-documented history of producing spin-off technologies in areas ranging from water filtration to medical imaging to structural materials to computing interfaces, not because NASA sets out to solve those civilian problems, but because solving the underlying physical and engineering challenges inherent in spaceflight happens to require solutions that generalize. Artemis II stands at a particular historical inflection point. It is the mission that either demonstrates that a new generation of deep space human spaceflight capability works, or that reveals what still needs to be fixed before it reliably does. Either outcome is valuable to the program, though obviously a successful mission is the preferred result. The program is designed to learn from each mission and improve. If Artemis II reveals problems, those problems will be investigated, understood, and addressed, as was done with the Artemis I heat shield finding. If Artemis II succeeds fully, it clears the path to Artemis III, which includes the first lunar landing in over 50 years. The astronauts who will walk on the lunar surface during Artemis III and later missions will stand on ground that no human has touched since December of 1972. They will be working in a polar region with scientific characteristics and resource potential that the Apollo missions never accessed. They will be supported by infrastructure, the Lunar Gateway, the Orion spacecraft, the Space Launch System, the commercial landers being developed under NASA's Human Landing System program that represents the combined effort of thousands of engineers, scientists, managers, and technicians over more than a decade. And all of it traces back, in a direct line of development, to the data and experience gathered during Artemis II, to what 4 people observed through 4 small windows, to what their bodies recorded in their blood and bones and neural circuits, to what they heard and felt and thought while they were farther from Earth than any living human had ever been. The universe does not offer second chances to civilizations that choose not to explore. The scientific questions that draw us outward, the composition of the solar system's volatile inventory, the radiation environment of deep space, the long-term physiology of humans beyond the magnetosphere, The surface geology of bodies, whose chemical records preserve the early history of our planetary system. These are questions with answers that exist, waiting to be found by whoever chooses to look for them. Artemis II is a step in the direction of looking. 4 people, a heat shield, and the accumulated engineering of a civilization pointing itself at the moon again. The radiation biology of deep space travel is one of the least publicly discussed but most scientifically significant aspects of Artemis II. The mission will produce the first direct measurements of radiation dose in a crewed vehicle at cislunar distances since the Apollo era, and the instruments aboard Orion are considerably more sophisticated than anything available in the 1960s and 70s. Radiation exposure in space is measured in a unit called the sievert, which accounts not just for the total energy deposited in tissue, but for the biological effectiveness of different types of radiation. Heavy ions, which are a component of galactic cosmic rays, are significantly more biologically damaging per unit of deposited energy than protons or electrons, because they cause more complex damage to the molecular structures of DNA. A dose of 1 sievert from heavy ions is considerably more biologically serious than a dose of 1 sievert from X-rays, which is why the biological weighting factor is included in the sievert unit. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration has established career radiation limits for astronauts based on estimates of excess cancer risk. Current limits are expressed in terms of the dose that would result in a 3% increase in lifetime cancer mortality risk. These limits vary by age and sex, because cancer risk from radiation is age-dependent and differs between biological males and females, with the latter being somewhat more sensitive to radiation-induced cancer at equivalent doses. For a lunar distance mission lasting 10 days, the total accumulated dose is modest, well within career limits for all 4 crew members. For a Mars mission lasting approximately 2 to 3 years, including the transit periods and surface time, the accumulated dose approaches or potentially exceeds current career limits, depending on solar activity levels and shielding assumptions. The Artemis II crew will wear personal dosimeters throughout the mission that measure the total radiation dose accumulated by each individual in real time. This data will be combined with the spacecraft-level radiation measurements from fixed instruments that monitor the radiation environment at multiple points inside and outside the capsule. The combination of individual dosimetry and environmental monitoring allows scientists to reconstruct not just the total dose, but the temporal pattern of exposure, which matters for understanding how the biological effects of radiation accumulate over time. One of the more concerning aspects of deep space radiation biology is the effect of galactic cosmic rays on the central nervous system. Laboratory studies with rodents exposed to heavy ion radiation have demonstrated measurable changes in cognitive performance and brain tissue structure at doses relevant to deep space mission scenarios. These effects, which do not have a well-established human analog from terrestrial radiation medicine, are a legitimate scientific concern for long-duration missions. 10 days of exposure accumulates too little dose to produce detectable central nervous system effects, but the animal studies inform the design of longer-duration human exposure research that the Artemis program will enable. The Sun's current activity level adds additional uncertainty to the radiation environment that Artemis II will encounter. Solar Cycle 25, which began in December of 2019, has been more active than the previous cycle and has produced several significant flare events. The space weather forecasting infrastructure, centered on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Space Weather Prediction Center, provides continuous monitoring and alerting capability, but the precision of solar event prediction remains limited by the complexity of solar magnetohydrodynamics. A large coronal mass ejection event that erupts from the far side of the Sun, where direct observation is limited, may have reduced warning time compared to events originating from the Earth-facing hemisphere. The Artemis II crew will be monitoring space weather data throughout the mission and will have protocols in place for rapid sheltering if the forecast indicates a significant event is incoming. The Orion spacecraft's communication infrastructure is worth understanding in some detail, because it defines both the capabilities and the limitations of the crew's connection to Earth throughout the mission. Orion uses the Deep Space Network, a global array of large radio antennas located at 3 sites roughly equally spaced around Earth's longitude, in California, Spain, and Australia. This distribution ensures that at any point in the spacecraft's orbit or trajectory, at least one antenna site has line-of-sight contact with the spacecraft. The Deep Space Network dishes are among the largest and most sensitive radio receivers in the world, capable of detecting the faint signals from spacecraft at planetary distances and beyond. For a spacecraft at lunar distance, the signal strength is much stronger than for interplanetary missions, making the communication link relatively robust. Voice communication, telemetry data, downlink, and command uplink all flow through this network. The crew has handheld microphones and communications headsets for voice calls, and the spacecraft's computers continuously downlink thousands of data channels to mission control, reporting temperatures, pressures, valve positions, power consumption, software states, and dozens of other parameters that the flight control team monitors around the clock. During the communication blackout of re-entry, this telemetry link is also severed, which is why mission control watches telemetry silence during re-entry as a confirmation that the blackout has begun, and then waits for signal reacquisition as a primary indication that the capsule has survived the peak heating phase. The cultural significance of Artemis II extends beyond its technical and scientific dimensions. The crew composition, with the first woman, first person of color, and first non-American to travel toward the moon, reflects a deliberate decision about who human exploration of deep space should represent. The Apollo program, which achieved extraordinary things, conducted human spaceflight with a workforce and crew roster that reflected the demographic realities and institutional constraints of its era. All 12 astronauts who walked on the lunar surface were white American men. The workforce that built and operated Apollo was overwhelmingly male and predominantly white, despite the essential contributions of women mathematicians, many of them black, who performed the orbital calculations that underpin the entire program. The decision to send a diverse crew to the moon on Artemis II is not a departure from the scientific and engineering seriousness of the mission. The crew was selected based on qualifications, experience, and demonstrated capability. The observation that these particular highly qualified individuals happen to represent the diversity of humanity is a reflection of how the astronaut corps has changed over 5 decades, in ways that parallel broader changes in who has access to scientific and engineering careers. Sending a crew that looks more like the actual diversity of humanity to explore a destination that belongs to all of humanity is not a concession to politics. It is an acknowledgement that exploration on behalf of the species should reflect the species. Jeremy Hansen's presence as the first non-American on a lunar distance mission represents the internationalization of deep space human spaceflight. The Artemis program's international partnership model, with hardware and crew contributions from Europe, Canada, Japan, and other partners, is a structural choice that reflects the scale of resources required for sustained lunar operations. No single national program has the budget and technical depth to sustain an ambitious lunar presence indefinitely. Distributing the program across multiple partners creates a more resilient and sustainable structure, while also spreading the scientific return and the political benefits of participation more broadly. The Canadian Space Agency's contribution to the Artemis architecture includes the Canadarm3 robotic system planned for the Lunar Gateway, a successor to the robotic arm systems that Canada has provided for the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station. In exchange for contributing this critical infrastructure, Canada received astronaut crew slots on Artemis missions, of which Jeremy Hansen's Artemis II slot is the first. This quid pro quo model is the basis of the international partnership agreements underlying the entire Artemis program, and it creates mutual investment in the program's success across multiple nations. The specific re-entry corridor that Artemis II will use on its return to Earth represents one of the most precisely computed parameters in the entire mission. The entry corridor is the narrow band of approach angles within which a returning spacecraft must aim. If the approach angle is too shallow, the spacecraft skips off the atmosphere like a stone off water, missing the entry entirely and continuing out into space on a trajectory that may or may not allow a return attempt. If the approach angle is too steep, the spacecraft enters too sharply, experiences deceleration forces that could structurally damage the vehicle or incapacitate the crew, and generates heating rates that could overwhelm the heat shield. The corridor is defined by these two failure modes, and the navigation team's job is to ensure that Orion arrives at the top of the atmosphere precisely within it. The navigation precision required is achievable with modern orbital mechanics computation and the spacecraft's onboard navigation systems, but it is not trivially easy. Throughout the 4 to 5 day return from the moon, the European Service Module engine will perform small trajectory correction maneuvers to maintain the re-entry corridor aim point within acceptable limits. These burns, sometimes called mid-course corrections, trim the trajectory as the precise location of the entry interface becomes more accurately determinable with accumulated tracking data. The specific physical location of the splashdown target off the coast of San Diego near the Navy recovery fleet is chosen based on multiple factors. The Pacific Ocean is a large body of water far from populated areas, which is relevant to the safety implications of recovery operations. The San Diego area is accessible to the naval facilities that support recovery operations. The downrange distance from the re-entry interface to the splashdown point, which depends on the entry trajectory, is compatible with the wind and weather patterns typically found in that region. The Navy recovery team trains for this operation using simulated capsule drops and open ocean exercises, and the logistics of winching a 9 metric ton capsule from the ocean onto the deck of an amphibious ship in whatever sea state prevails on recovery day have been rehearsed carefully. Post-recovery medical assessment begins immediately on the recovery ship. Each crew member is evaluated for cardiovascular status, dehydration, cognitive function, and orthostatic tolerance, which refers to their ability to maintain blood pressure when standing upright after an extended period in the gravity-free environment. The known physiological effects of 10 days of spaceflight include some degree of cardiovascular deconditioning, reductions in blood volume, changes in fluid distribution, and the balance disruption caused by the inner ear readapting to gravitational cues. The medical team anticipates these effects and has protocols for managing them. Most are temporary and resolve within days to weeks. Blood and urine samples collected before, during, and after the mission will be analyzed for a wide range of biomarkers relevant to radiation exposure, bone metabolism, muscle catabolism, immune function, and microbiome composition. The gut microbiome, the community of microorganisms living in the digestive tract, has been shown in research on International Space Station crew members to shift during spaceflight in ways that may be relevant to immune function and overall health. Understanding how these changes develop over 10 days at lunar distance under the radiation environment of cislunar space adds a new data dimension to the growing body of spaceflight biomedical research. The psychological assessment conducted after Artemis II will be one of the more carefully analyzed elements of the mission's science return. The subjective experience of traveling to lunar distance, of seeing the far side of the moon and the distant Earth with their own eyes, of navigating the physical challenges and interpersonal dynamics of 10 days in a small shared space, will be documented through structured interviews, written records maintained during the mission, and standardized psychological assessments administered before and after flight. This qualitative and quantitative data on the human experience of deep space travel is irreplaceable. The Apollo astronauts who went to the moon described experiences that range from the profoundly moving to the surprisingly mundane. The mission's logistics consumed the majority of their attention. Procedures, checklists, system monitoring, and the demands of the mission itself left relatively little time for pure experience of the environment. But in the moments when the press of immediate tasks eased, the perceptual impact of being where they were broke through. Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 lunar module pilot, described an overwhelming sense of connectedness and cosmic scale during the return from the moon, an experience he spent decades afterward trying to describe and understand. Alan Bean, the Apollo 12 lunar module pilot, turned to painting after his astronaut career as a way to capture what he had seen and felt on the lunar surface in ways that words alone could not convey. Neil Armstrong, famously reticent about the emotional dimensions of his experience, nonetheless noted that he was aware during the moonwalk that he was representing all of humanity. The Artemis II crew will have their own versions of these experiences, shaped by who they individually are, by the differences between this mission and Apollo, and by the specific conditions of the 21st century context in which they are flying. They will have better cameras, higher bandwidth communication links, and decades of accumulated human spaceflight psychology research informing how they approach and process the experience. They will also have something none of the Apollo astronauts had: the knowledge that billions of people are watching, not just in the immediate sense of mission coverage, but in the sense that their mission occurs in an era of social media and ubiquitous global communication in which their accounts will reach people in every country on Earth, almost instantaneously. What they bring back from the moon, the data, the samples of the radiation environment recorded in their tissues and their instruments, the photographs, the engineering assessments, and the accounts of what it is like to be there, will contribute to something that cannot be fully defined in advance. Exploration changes the people who do it, and the societies they represent, in ways that only become visible in retrospect. Columbus's voyages did not immediately transform European civilization. The results unfolded over decades and centuries. The Apollo program's long-term influence on science, engineering, technology, and human self-understanding has been accumulating for 50 years and continues to be felt. Artemis II is the beginning of another chapter. The question that remains scientifically open, and that the entire Artemis program is oriented toward answering in stages, is whether humanity can establish a sustainable, long-term presence beyond Earth's surface. Not just visiting, which Apollo proved is possible, but operating continuously, learning, building, and eventually becoming a multi-world species. The technical obstacles to that goal are formidable and well understood. The radiation environment of deep space, the physiological effects of reduced gravity on human biology, the closed-loop life support requirements of long-duration missions, the energy systems needed for surface operations, the communication infrastructure required to maintain contact with Earth during Mars missions, where light-speed delays reach up to 24 minutes one way. None of these obstacles is physically impossible to overcome. They are engineering problems with physics-allowed solutions. The solutions are expensive, complex, and time-consuming to develop, but they are not beyond human capability. The question is whether the sustained commitment of resources, attention, and will required to develop them will be maintained over the decades-long timescales needed to reach the ultimate goal. Artemis II does not answer that question. What it does is demonstrate that the first step works, that a crew of 4 can leave Earth, travel to the moon, and return safely using hardware and trajectories that have been designed, tested, and validated with the full benefit of modern engineering tools and the hard-won lessons of 6 decades of human spaceflight. That demonstration, if successful, makes every subsequent step more credible and more achievable. The 4 people strapping into integrity on launch day are carrying more than survival suits and freeze-dried food. They are carrying the expectation of 8 billion people who have never left Earth and the memory of 12 who set foot on another world and came home. They are the bridge between what we achieved in the 1960s and 70s and what we are attempting to build now. Their mission is not the destination. It is the proof that the destination is reachable. When they splash down off San Diego, when the hatch opens, and they breathe outdoor air and squint in sunlight after 10 days in an artificial sky, the next chapter will already have begun. Engineers will be analyzing their data. Doctors will be monitoring their readaptation. Scientists will be processing their radiation measurements and their photographs. And mission planners will be incorporating their crew reports into the design of Artemis III. The door has been closed since 1972. Artemis II is the key. To understand the full significance of Artemis II, it is worth revisiting in detail what the Apollo program actually accomplished and how much institutional knowledge was built and then lost in the decades that followed. Because the gap between Apollo 17 and Artemis II is not just a gap in flight experience. It is a gap in organizational memory, in manufacturing capability, in supply chains, in workforce expertise, and in the accumulated culture of solving deep space problems in real time. When Saturn V rockets were being built at the peak of the Apollo program, the facilities and workforce involved were substantial. The Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, served as the center of Saturn development. Boeing, North American Aviation, and Douglas Aircraft were the primary contractors for the first, second, and third stages respectively. Thousands of engineers and technicians had hands-on experience with the specific metallurgy, propulsion chemistry, guidance systems, and test procedures that made Saturn V work. When the program ended and production was shut down, that expertise dispersed over a period of years as people retired, changed careers, or moved to other programs. The institutional memory problem in aerospace development is real and well documented. When the shuttle program ended in 2011 and NASA began developing the Space Launch System, one of the technical challenges was that many of the specific manufacturing and processing procedures for key components were not fully documented in retrievable form. They existed in the heads of experienced personnel who had since retired. Some of the procedures for processing the RS-25 engine's turbopumps, for example, had to be partially reconstructed through a combination of archived documents, interviews with retired workers, and experimental testing because the original process documentation was incomplete or inaccessible. This is not unique to the space program. It is a general challenge in any engineering domain where the most critical knowledge is tacit and procedural rather than explicit and documented. The Space Launch System benefits from the RS-25 shuttle heritage, but the heritage is not a complete substitute for continuous operational experience. The shuttle's RS-25 engines were refurbished and reused across multiple flights, which gave the maintenance and processing teams extensive hands-on experience with the engine's behavior over its operational life. The Space Launch System uses the engines in an expendable configuration, meaning each set of 4 engines flies once and is not recovered. This eliminates the refurbishment cycle, but also eliminates the feedback loop from operating the same engines across multiple flights. The engines used on Artemis missions are drawn from the existing shuttle-era inventory, a finite pool of hardware that will eventually be supplemented by new production RS-25 engines with a more modern manufacturing approach. This kind of supply chain and manufacturing continuity challenge is present throughout the Artemis program. The ablative heat shield material, AVCOAT, has to be manufactured to specifications that must match the original qualified material while also incorporating manufacturing improvements developed since Apollo. The thermal protection tiles and blankets on the outer surface of the Orion command module have to be produced with the same thermal properties as the design requires while being manufacturable with current equipment and materials. Each component has a complex qualification story, and the overall system qualification of Orion, as a flight vehicle, is built from thousands of individual component and subsystem qualifications that together constitute the evidence that the vehicle will behave as designed. The European Service Module's development illustrates the benefits and complexities of the international partnership approach. Airbus Defence and Space, working under contract to the European Space Agency, developed the service module at facilities in Bremen, Germany. The design drew on heritage from the Automated Transfer Vehicle, an uncrewed cargo spacecraft that the European Space Agency flew to the International Space Station on 5 missions between 2008 and 2014. The ATV used a similar propulsion and power architecture, and many of the engineers and designers who worked on it transitioned to the ESM program, carrying institutional knowledge from one program to the next. This kind of expertise transfer between related programs is exactly how aerospace organizations try to preserve and build on previous experience rather than starting from scratch. The 4 solar array wings on the European Service Module, each about 7 meters long and stretching approximately 19 meters tip to tip when fully deployed, generate roughly 11 kilowatts of electrical power in full sunlight. This power runs all of Orion's electrical systems: the computers, the life support fans and pumps, the communications equipment, the navigation sensors, the lighting, the crew's laptops and tablets, the medical monitoring equipment, and the thermal control system. Managing the spacecraft's electrical power budget, ensuring that all these loads can be supported within the available generation capacity while maintaining battery reserves for periods of shadow and contingencies, is a continuous engineering task during flight operations. The propulsion system of the European Service Module uses a main engine capable of producing 400 newtons of thrust, supplemented by 24 smaller attitude control thrusters that provide fine control of the spacecraft's orientation and perform small velocity corrections. The main engine fires for the critical course corrections that keep Orion on its planned trajectory, and for the small burns needed to refine the re-entry aim point. The total propellant load, stored in tanks within the service module, is sized to provide a margin above the expected burn requirements, so that even if early burns consume more propellant than planned, sufficient reserves remain for the mission-critical burns later. Water and oxygen for the crew's life support are also stored in the European Service Module. Oxygen is maintained in high-pressure tanks and released into the cabin at the rate needed to maintain the cabin pressure and composition. Water is stored in tanks and distributed to the crew dispensing system within the cabin. The carbon dioxide scrubbing system uses the cabin air circulation fans to draw air through canisters of lithium hydroxide, where the CO2 reacts chemically with the lithium hydroxide to form lithium carbonate, effectively removing the CO2 from the air. Used canisters are replaced periodically throughout the mission. The thermal control system maintains the spacecraft's temperature within habitable and operational ranges, despite the extreme thermal environment of deep space. In direct sunlight, the spacecraft receives significant solar energy and must reject the excess heat to maintain cool internal temperatures. In shadow, the spacecraft must retain enough heat to prevent freezing of components and propellants. The thermal control system uses a combination of insulation, radiators, heaters, and heat pipes to manage this balance continuously. The gold-colored thermal blankets visible on spacecraft in flight are part of this system, reflecting solar radiation to reduce the heating load on the structure beneath them. Navigation during the transit to and from the moon uses a combination of systems. The primary navigation method is radio ranging, in which precisely timed radio signals are exchanged between the spacecraft and the Deep Space Network antennas to measure the spacecraft's distance and velocity with high accuracy. The Orion capsule also carries an autonomous star tracker, a camera system that identifies known stars in its field of view and uses their positions to determine the spacecraft's orientation. Combining range and range rate data from the ground network with the spacecraft's own orientation measurements produces a navigation solution accurate enough to target the precise re-entry corridor on return. The guidance, navigation, and control computer aboard Orion computes the spacecraft's position and velocity continuously, comparing the measured state against the planned trajectory and generating commands to the attitude control thrusters and the service module engine as needed to maintain the desired path. The software running these computations represents decades of development and testing, incorporating lessons from the Apollo guidance computer, the shuttle flight software, and the advanced avionics developed for both crewed and robotic space missions in the intervening years. Modern spacecraft computers are millions of times more capable than the Apollo guidance computer, which had less computational power than a current smartphone. And this capability allows far more sophisticated navigation and fault detection algorithms to run in real time. The fault detection and isolation software aboard Orion continuously monitors thousands of sensor readings and compares them against expected values and predefined fault signatures. If a sensor reading deviates beyond allowed limits, or if a combination of readings matches a pattern associated with a known failure mode, the software triggers an alert or takes automatic corrective action, depending on the severity of the situation. This automated fault response capability is critical because the crew cannot monitor every system simultaneously, and because some faults require faster response than human reaction time allows. The software has been extensively tested through hardware-in-the-loop simulations, failure mode testing, and the Artemis I flight, and its behavior under the actual deep space environment will be characterized in more detail by Artemis II. The crew interfaces, the displays and controls through which the astronauts interact with Orion systems, have been designed to present the most critical information clearly and to give the crew the ability to take manual control when needed. The display design philosophy reflects decades of human factors research on how pilots and astronauts process information under stress, make decisions with incomplete information, and manage workload during high-demand phases of flight. The large touchscreen displays show the crew a summary of spacecraft health, current trajectory, and system status in formats that allow rapid situational assessment. Dedicated physical controls for critical functions, such as abort initiation, allow time-critical responses without requiring navigation through software menus. The suits the crew wears during launch and re-entry, the Orion Crew Survival System suits, are connected to the spacecraft's life support system during flight, receiving pressurized oxygen through umbilical connections that keep the suits inflated and the crew breathing if the cabin loses pressure. In the event of a cabin pressure loss during the critical phases of flight, the suits automatically switch to providing life support from their own onboard oxygen supply, protecting the crew while the system transition occurs. The suits have been designed to allow reasonable mobility for in-cabin tasks, and also to provide the thermal protection needed to survive a water landing in the suit if an emergency required the crew to exit the capsule in a marine environment. The parachute system that decelerates Orion from supersonic speeds to splashdown represents one of the largest parachute systems ever deployed on a spacecraft. The three main parachutes, each approximately 37 meters in diameter, together have a combined canopy area that, if laid flat, would cover an area approximately the size of a large athletic stadium. They are packed into canisters in the forward section of the command module and must open reliably after surviving a re-entry environment that includes the plasma heating, the mechanical stresses of deceleration, and the shock loads of drogue parachute deployment. The parachute system has been tested in development drop tests, in which instrumented Orion-like test articles were dropped from aircraft at altitudes matching the conditions of operational deployment. These tests verified that the parachutes deploy and fill correctly across the range of conditions that could be encountered during re-entry. The water impact dynamics when the capsule hits the ocean surface have been analyzed extensively using both computational fluid dynamics models and physical scale testing. The impact loads are transmitted through the capsule structure to the crew seats, and the seats are designed with stroke and damping mechanisms that reduce the peak acceleration experienced by the crew during impact. Seated crew members experience the impact as a sharp jolt, roughly comparable to a significant vehicle collision, but the seat design and their protective suits limit the likelihood of injury. Immediately after impact, The capsule bobs in the ocean, swells, and the crew transitions to post-landing procedures while the recovery team closes in. The 10 days of Artemis II, from the moment of engine ignition at Pad 39B to the moment the hatch opens on the recovery ship, will be the most thoroughly documented 10 days of human spaceflight at lunar distance in history. Every sensor reading, every crew voice recording, every medical measurement, every system state transition, every trajectory update will be recorded, transmitted to the ground, and archived for analysis. The data volume will be enormous. The analysis will take months and years, and the findings will shape every human spaceflight mission that follows. That is the purpose of exploration at its most basic level: to go where we have not been, to measure what we have not measured, to observe what we have not observed, and to learn things that we could not have learned without going. Artemis II is, in that fundamental sense, exactly what human spaceflight has always been, and exactly what the next generation of it needs to be. The 4 astronauts know this. It is why they trained for years, why they asked the hard questions about the heat shield, why they chose to go knowing what they know. They are scientists, pilots, engineers, and explorers. They understand both the risk and the value of what they are doing with a precision that no outside observer can fully replicate. When the engines ignite, when the shaking begins, when the solid boosters separate and the ride smooths and the engines cut off and their arms float up from their laps, they will be the farthest humans from Earth in over 50 years. And everything they learn will make the next mission more possible, and the one after that more possible still, until the gap that opened in December of 1972 is not just closed but permanently eliminated, and the presence of human beings in deep space is no longer an achievement, but a fact of how our civilization operates. That is where this leads. Artemis II is not the destination. It is the first step back toward a future that was interrupted and is now resuming. 4 people, a heat shield, and 50 years of accumulated knowledge pointing at the moon. There is one more dimension of Artemis II that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most difficult to discuss with precision: what it means for the people who built this mission and are watching it fly. The engineers at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, who designed and tested the Orion life support systems, many of whom have spent their entire careers working toward this moment, will be sitting at consoles in mission control when the vehicle lifts off. The Orion program manager and her team, who navigated the heat shield investigation, made the decision to change the trajectory rather than the material, and certified the vehicle for crewed flight, will be watching those numbers on their screens during re-entry, with an intimacy of technical knowledge that is unlike anything a casual observer can bring to the same moment. The engineers at Airbus in Bremen, who built and integrated the European service module, will be watching from thousands of kilometers away. The scientists at universities and research institutions who designed the radiation instruments and will spend the next year analyzing the data will be waiting for the first data packages to download from the spacecraft. The former Apollo engineers, who are still alive, now in their 80s and 90s, have been watching the development of Artemis for years, and some have consulted on specific technical questions where their expertise from 50 years ago remains directly relevant. This is the human infrastructure behind a spaceflight mission. Not just the 4 people inside the capsule, but the thousands who put them there. The manufacturing workers who fabricated the engine nozzles and the heat shield panels. The test engineers who ran the simulation campaigns and the environmental qualification tests. The trajectory analysts who computed the entry corridor aim point. The flight directors who will manage the mission from launch to splashdown. The recovery divers who will enter the ocean on splashdown day and attach flotation collars to a 9 metric ton capsule in whatever sea state prevails. All of them are as much a part of Artemis II as the crew. This is the social reality of modern exploration. It is not a lone adventurer striking out into unknown territory. It is a coordinated, interdependent enterprise involving thousands of specialists whose contributions are so deeply interwoven that the mission cannot succeed without every node in the network performing correctly. The astronauts are the most visible representatives of this enterprise, and their courage and skill are genuine and significant. But they are, in an important sense, the product of an enormous collaborative effort that begins years before launch and continues long after splashdown. The budget required to sustain this enterprise is a recurring subject of discussion in the policy community. The Artemis program has consumed billions of dollars in development funding across its various elements: the Space Launch System, the Orion spacecraft, the European Service Module, the ground systems at Kennedy Space Center, the Lunar Gateway development, and the Commercial Human Landing System program that will provide the landers for surface missions. The total cost from program inception through Artemis II's launch has been estimated at several tens of billions of dollars by various accounting methodologies. Whether this investment is worthwhile is a question that reasonable people can analyze from multiple perspectives. The direct scientific return, in terms of data and discoveries, is real but not easily quantified against cost. The indirect returns in technology development, workforce expertise, industrial capability, and international partnership value are broader and harder to measure. The inspirational value, the effect on public engagement with science and engineering, on student interest in technical fields, and on the general sense of what human civilization is capable of, is the most diffuse and most contested benefit. Apollo is often cited as having inspired a generation of engineers and scientists. The specific empirical basis for that claim is difficult to establish rigorously. What is clearer is that in the decades since Apollo, the programs that maintained human spaceflight capability, the shuttle, and then the station, continued to produce scientists and engineers who found the work meaningful and chose careers oriented around it. Whether Artemis will have similar effects on the next generation is, in the most literal sense, an empirical question whose answer will only become apparent over the coming decades. What the mission offers the present moment is something more immediate. The knowledge that human beings are going back, that the 53-year gap is ending, that 4 specific people whose names we know, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen, they are climbing into a capsule and trusting their lives to the engineering of their colleagues and predecessors, and pointing themselves at the same target that 12 people stood on between 1969 and 1972. That what was interrupted is resuming. The moon has been there for 4.5 billion years. It will be there for billions more. The question has never been whether the destination was accessible. The question has always been whether the will to reach it was present and sustained. For 53 years, it was not sufficient. The technology existed in various forms. The engineering talent existed. The scientific motivation existed. But the sustained institutional and political commitment did not. Artemis II is evidence that the commitment has reconstituted itself sufficiently to execute the first step. Whether it will sustain itself through Artemis III, Artemis IV, the Gateway, and the longer arc of human presence beyond Earth orbit is not guaranteed. History provides examples of programs that reached similar early milestones and then contracted or ended. History also provides examples of programs that built on early milestones to achieve things that seemed impossible from the starting point. Artemis II will not resolve that historical question, but it will answer the immediate technical and engineering question. Can we send 4 people to the moon and bring them back, safely, using the system we have built? If the answer is yes, the next question is already waiting. The crew of Artemis II will answer the first question with their bodies and their skill, and their willingness to sit on top of 8.8 million pounds of thrust and fly away from everything they know. The rest of us will watch and wait and find out what comes next.